when you want to find out about who someone is, what they're like, it's usually helpful to ask the people who know them best. For example, if I wanted to know what kind of parent your mom is, I could ask her and she could have answers, but you, as her child, will have an insight to that answer that she probably couldn't provide. Most of you do this when you're interested in talking to someone. You likely will go to their friend, probably their best friend first, and you would ask, hey, what are they like? Like, I know what they look like, I know what they do, but what are they really like? And this is exactly why when you apply for a job, you usually have to put down some personal references. These are people that know you and will be able to verify that who you say you are is true. Because you can tell them, I'm reliable, I show up on time, I'm a hard worker. But if nobody in your life can verify that, they're not going to want to hire you. And so when we're trying to get to know someone, it is very insightful to ask the people around them, what are they like? And this is why Jesus is such a unique historical figure, because Jesus did not only say things about himself, but everyone that interacted with him, everyone around him said the very same things. I will show you an example on the screen. From John, one of his close friends, it's in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. It says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And like I said, I want to highlight, this is one of Jesus' best friends that wrote these words. And he actually wrote these words a couple decades after Jesus died on the cross, resurrected, and ascended back into heaven. And at the time of writing this, it is very likely that all of the other disciples who had followed Jesus personally had also died. And tradition tells us that John was probably the youngest guys to follow Jesus when Jesus was on earth, and then he was also one of the ones to live the longest. So John is writing this after Jesus has gone back to heaven and other disciples have died, and John realizes that because a lot of the eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus are passing away, he thinks it's a good idea to write down what happened with Jesus so that the stories about Jesus can spread, and the ones that do are true. Because we obviously know this, there was no printing press back then. They couldn't just go somewhere and pick up a history book and learn about the life of Jesus so easily. The way that stories were passed, or the way that things like this were passed down throughout the generations was through stories and people sharing those stories. And so for the first couple decades of John's career, we learned that he traveled around telling people about the story of Jesus. He was able to tell people how he himself, very personally, and the other guys who were Jesus' disciples, how he witnessed everything Jesus did. He heard what Jesus taught. And most importantly, he was able to tell people how he saw Jesus die and then raised from the dead 3 days later. And now that John's getting older, he's realizing, okay, I'm not going to be around much longer to tell my story. So he writes down a collection of stories, actual moments that he experiences with Jesus, so that other people can learn about Jesus, so that today we can open the book called the Bible and learn about Jesus. And so we just read, that's actually what we just read was at the end of John's account. It was at the end of John's story. And so what we're going to look at now is the way he started it. There's 2 verses that'll be on the screen in the beginning of John. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And then a couple verses later in this chapter, it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and the only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And now I want to zone in on that second one, verse 14. It'll be on the screen by itself at first. It says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. And in the next slide, what we're going to do is break this down just a little bit. We're not going to go into too much detail, but the Word, when it says the Word, it is referring to God's Word. When it says flesh, it's a funny way of saying human. We all know we have flesh. So saying God's Word became human and made his dwelling among us. Now, I am not going to pretend like I know how to say that word in Greek. Evan probably does. But that is the Greek word for dwelling, and the definition is to pitch a tent. And it sounds funny, but it is a very interesting choice of language that John is using here. So what John is doing is he is connecting the life of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, to something that we see in the Old Testament. I don't know if you know this, but you probably already know this, most of you do, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Old Testament is at the beginning of our Bible, and it is the first part of our Bible. It is full of history, it is full of the ancient law, prophecy, and wisdom literature of the ancient people of Israel. And in the second book of the Old Testament, which is Exodus, we read about the Israelites and their exodus. Or their departure and freedom from Egypt, and their journey to the promised land. And now this is quite the journey. There is a lot that happens. I'd encourage you to read it on your own time. It's pretty interesting. But they are led by a man named Moses, whom most of us have probably heard many stories about. And throughout this journey, there were many moments where God speaks to Moses. We read about God speaking to him through a burning bush. We read about him speaking to Moses on top of mountains. And then we read about them talking in a tent. In Exodus 33, verse 7, it says, Moses used to make a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent and meet outside the camp. And then we go on to learn that whenever God's presence would dwell within this tent of meeting, there would be this cloud that covered the entrance of the tent while he spoke with Moses. And later in the book, we actually learn that the Israelites based their traveling on whether or not God's presence was dwelling in the tent, also called the tabernacle. If the cloud was ever lifted and was no longer there, then they would set on their journey and until the cloud returned so that they knew that God was with them. This tent was so significant to them because it meant that God would be with them. It was a place of worship, a holy space, a sacred space, but it was a tent. And so when John is talking about Jesus pitching a tent among us, for the readers at that time, they would have thought of this image right away. They had heard stories upon stories of their ancestors wandering the wilderness and God speaking to Moses in this tent and the cloud covering the entrance. And for us today, it may take a little bit more of connecting those dots. When John is describing the life of Jesus, his best friend, he is essentially saying that Jesus' life is the new tent. And whether we realize it or not, this has pretty profound implications on our life today, because there will be a list of things that the tent was on the screen. And it's because the tent was where God was. That was all where God was. The tent was where the law was preserved. It was kept there, the law of Moses. The tent was where sacrifices were made. People would take animals and sacrifice them to cover their sins. It is where revelation and understanding about God was found. But now, through the person of Jesus, not a temporary tent, we can find all of these things. And this is the good news about Jesus' life. Jesus is God in human form. We don't have to go somewhere specific to find God. We can look to Jesus. When trying to figure out the law or what is right and what is wrong, we can look at the life of Jesus, what he said, what he did, how he treated people to understand those things. When back then, they needed to go to the tent, like I said, and sacrifice animals to cover their sins. But instead, we find forgiveness in Jesus. We don't have to do anything crazy like that to get our sins forgiven. When we're trying to understand who God is, what he's like, why is he doing the things that he's doing, I don't understand, we can actually look to Jesus' life to make sense of those things, because ultimately his life reflects God's character. Like we read, he is God in human form. And so this would have meant so much to the early readers of John's words. But even for us today, when we do find ourselves wondering, what is God like? Who is he actually? We could look at Jesus' life to learn what God is like. There are no rituals, no set of rules that we need to follow as if we were entering a tent like the ancient Israelites all those years ago. We can now go straight to Jesus to find a response to those wonderings. And John and the disciples learned so much about God through their friend Jesus. They actually walked with him here on earth, and they discovered so much about God's character in that time. And a good example of this is when Jesus was having dinner with his disciples the night before he was arrested. And John, we're going to continue talking about John's account, tells a story of Jesus at this dinner. And he then goes on to explain how Jesus does something that no one was expecting him to do. Keep in mind, his disciples had seen him feed thousands of people, heal sick people, cast out demons, stand up to corrupt leaders, bring people back to life. They were very used to seeing Jesus do amazing things. But this moment that John is going to write about feels different. It's not like those other things. And now we don't have time to read the whole scene because John records a lot of details. He says that as they're eating, Jesus gets up from this meal. He takes off the outer layer of his outfit. There were a lot of layers. He wrapped a towel around himself. He poured water into a bowl, walks over to one of the disciples, and begins to wash his feet. And John even records like the little details about Jesus wiping him with a towel. And now this sounds very strange to us today. I do not know what I would do if somebody just started washing my feet. But foot washing was known to be the job of the lowest servant in the household. It was messy and gross because in the ancient world, people wore sandals, and we know there were no nice cemented roads like we have today. There was dirt everywhere, so people's feet were disgusting. So a lowly servant would wash people's feet before dinner. But in this moment, Jesus, God in human form, was there doing the job of a servant for his friends. And then John goes on to record what Jesus says after washing their feet. In John 13, verse 12, it says, "When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. 'Do you understand what I have done for you?' he asked them. 'You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am.'" He said, "You call me Lord, and rightly so, that is what I am." In confirming who he is, Jesus is giving the disciples a reminder that though he is God and he has all things in his hands, it is not his success, showing off his ability, flashing his power, or demanding services that reflects God's character. But instead, it is his heart to serve his friends whom he loved. Jesus did not, in this moment, simply exchange his title of God for the title of servant just for a moment. But God's character was actually revealed to these men, to his friends, in the form of a servant. What John remembers in this moment was not just his friend Jesus washing his feet and doing something nice for him, but God himself revealing a part of his character to them and setting an example of what service to others looks like. And this is why John ends his gospel about Jesus with the words that we read earlier. Can we throw up chapter 20 again? Verses 30 and 31 in the beginning. Sorry, Isaiah. It says, "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." He was not just a good teacher. He was not just someone that performed miracles and not just someone who was really humble and willing to serve and be nice to others. He is the Messiah, the Son of God. And so for John, the good news about Jesus' life is that it shows us what God is like. That by looking at Jesus, what he taught, how he lived, we can actually discover who God is. And that's actually going to take us to our last question for the day. So John described Jesus as a lot of things. And one of the things that he wanted to be super clear about throughout his book was that he believed his friend was actually God in human form. And John was confident of that because, like we said, of what he experienced with Jesus. And now we've all had our own experience with Jesus. There are things that we have been taught. There are things that we heard all the time growing up. Maybe there are things that we've actually experienced for ourselves. And so the question that we want to discuss this morning is, how would you describe Jesus to somebody who knew nothing about him? When you think about the things that you believe about Jesus, the things that you've experienced, how would you describe him to somebody who knew absolutely nothing? And most of you are probably thinking of what you should say. You're thinking of the right answer and not actually what you believe. And so the reason we're doing this is so that you can say what you actually believe. And now what you say won't get you in trouble, but obviously please be respectful to the people at your table and what they believe. it may be different than what you believe. It may be different than what you've experienced. And so we're going to take a couple minutes to discuss and for you to truly think about what would you say? How would you describe? It could be as simple as like, I just know growing up in church, like, he loves us. Like, if that's what you know, then that's what you know. And so I hope that you can come to a place where you are actually thinking, what do I think about Jesus? And then we will pray and close when you guys are done. I hope some of you were able to think of an answer. It was very clear that some of you didn't, but that's okay. I encourage you that if you couldn't think of anything, to figure out what your answer is to that question. Maybe jot it down and like I said, be honest with yourself. I think oftentimes when we're in church, we are always tempted to just kind of say what we've heard, or to say what we think is the right answer, to say like the nice, pretty sounding things, even though it's not really how we feel. And so I'd encourage you, be honest with yourself. Even if you didn't want to share with other students, finding a leader and saying like, hey, this is what I actually believe about Jesus. Like, can I walk through this with you? Can you answer some questions? Or asking a parent, or even writing it down and reflecting on it by yourself. Whatever it takes for you to be honest about what you believe, I think you owe that to yourself, especially if you've grown up in church. Because I grew up in church, and there was so much that I just kind of caught, that I was just like, this is what I say, this is what I do, this is how I believe, but I never believed it. And so I had to figure out for myself, how do I get to that place where I believe this for myself, not just because I've heard it passed down over and over again. And so I'd encourage you to think of that answer to that question. If you didn't have one, you can ask questions. Like I said, the leaders are here. You can read the books of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Jesus' friends. They write a lot about Jesus and his life here. So if you want to start there, we'd encourage that. But over the next 2 weeks, leading up to Easter, like I said, we're going to continue looking at the person of Jesus and why his life, his death, and his resurrection, why it matters to us today. So